All right, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the skeletal system and articulations, joints, and how they work together. But as a quick review, the skeletal system really provides a framework that determines our shape and our size. And we all come in different shapes and sizes, and everybody's skeletal system is a little bit different. A couple of kind of fun facts that are worth their weight in salt. You can roughly predict the size of an adult if you double their height at age 2. So a child at age 2 who's 36 inches will probably be about 6 feet tall. The general shape and your size is inherited, but there is a significant influence on nutrition, activity levels, and postural habits. So we can have an impact on how tall we are based on our nutrition habits. And if we look at various locations around the world, we'll see a significant difference in shape and size based on adequate nutrition. And bone is actually, we think of it as kind of this inert tissue, and it's actually really dynamic. It's constantly changing. There's constantly bone material being laid down, constantly bone material being absorbed, and bone will change its shape based on the demands that are placed on it. So there's this concept that I can have an impact on the shape of a bone by applying a load to it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So when I look at what are the functions of the skeletal system, one is it provides a system of levers that allow us to move through space. And the musculature generates the forces that allow that motion to occur around an axis. So with the skeletal system and our joints and the muscular system providing those forces, we will create movement, and the movement will be dependent upon the type of bone, the type of lever, and the type of joint that is at the end of the joint, or at the end of the bone. The skeletal system provides support to maintain upright posture. Again, if we apply a certain type of load, our posture can change, and a change in posture will have an impact on joint surface and joint function, and will have an impact on muscular function. Then lastly, our skeletal system will provide protection of vital organs. So we can see how our ribs surround the lungs and surround the heart to maintain protection during daily activities. We have different types of bones. We have cortical bone, we have cancellous bone. Cortical bone is also called compact bone. It is much more dense. It tends to surround a long bone and provides the stability. So that area would be the cortical area of the long bone. We have cancellous bones, or spongy bone, and that is an area of much greater porosity. So we have much more mobility in the cancellous bone, much more stability in the compact bone. So we have different classifications of bone. Long bones are longer than they are wide. So a good example of a long bone is the humerus or the femur. Both of these are tibia, fibula. These are all examples of long bones. The shaft will tend to widen toward the end, and that section is called the metaphysis. The metaphysis is just before, and that's where the growth plate occurs in adolescence. And the end of the bone is called the epiphysis, and again, that area is what is separated by the growth plate from the metaphysis. Short bones, examples of short bones would be the talus in the foot. So again, Short bones, the tarsals are another example. They are primarily cancellous or spongy bones covered with a thin layer of cortical bone. Flat bones are things like the ribs and the sternum. Primarily 2 layers of cortical bones with a layer of cancellous bone in between. And they are typically there functioning to protect internal structures, and they offer real broad areas for muscle attachment. In the lower extremity, the pelvis is really the best example of a flat bone. Irregular bones. Irregular bones are typically thin layer of cortical bones, and that is surrounding the cancellous bones. They provide a variety of functions, and the best example is a vertebrae. And you can see by the example of our vertebrae, there is projections off of this bone, and there is which are areas for muscular attachments and ligamentous attachments. There's the body of the vertebrae in the end, which provides an area to transmit forces and loads through. So an irregular bone functions to help muscle attachments, ligaments attachment, and a significant opportunity to transmit forces through the body and absorb those forces. The last example is the patella, which is an example of a sesamoid bone. And sesamoid bones are really floating bones that the patella is really a floating bone that provides an opportunity to create an extended lever arm, as we talked about in the last section. So if I can extend the lever, the moment arm, the lever arm, I can create more torque around that axis, and that's the function of the patella. There's also a couple of sesamoids in the first metatarsal or MTP joint, metatarsophalangeal joint, that provides an increased distance between the axis of rotation and the flexor hallucis brevis tendon. So, as I had mentioned earlier, there is an issue of how the biomechanical characteristics of the bone will change, and this is an example of Wolff's law. Wolff's law essentially states that for every change in form and function of a bone, or their function alone, is followed by a certain definitive change in their internal architecture. That's a big way of saying if we apply a load, the load's going to change the shape of the bone. And this is an example of Osgood Slaughter's, where the tibial tuberosity on this individual has grown excessively as a result of the tensile load of the patellar tendon where it attaches to the tibial tuberosity. Physical activity will also have a big function of on how our bones react. We know that that we can increase the density of bone with weight-bearing exercise. So for individuals that are at risk or have osteoporosis or osteopenia, we know that we can increase their bone density with weight-bearing and weightlifting activities. The same thing, we can expect that an individual who is laying in bed is going to lose bone density. And one of the biggest challenges that our astronauts have is they lose an excessive amount of bone density extremely rapidly when they're in space. So when they get back to Earth, they have lost significant bone structure. So physical activity will have a big impact and on bone function, and loads, stresses will have a big impact on the bony architecture, skeletal architecture. Which leads us to this concept of the strength and the stiffness of bone. And we can look at strength and stiffness as a function of a stress-strain curve. Every tissue that we know we can plot against a stress and strain. Stress is another way of saying load. Strain is another way of saying change in shape or deformation in shape. So if I apply a load along my stress lane, I'm going to have a definitive change in shape. Now, if that change in shape makes it up to the yield point, and I then remove the stress, or I remove the load, the material, or in this case the bone, will return to its normal resting shape. So we won't have a permanent change in shape. If I end up beyond the yield point, I start to see a curve occurring in my stress strain curve. So it takes much less load, much less stress to create a faster, more significant change in the deformation or the strain or the shape, and will occur until I finally reach a point of ultimate stress where I'll see a big change in shape with very little change in load until it finally fractures completely. And that position between the yield point and the failure point is called the plastic region, in that when we release the load, it's not going to return to its original shape. So the slope of this line, this allows us to really identify the stiffness and the strength of whatever the material is. So in this case, the material being bone, we could have a higher sloping curve would be a stiffer, or a lower sloping curve would be a more elastic type of, more pliable type of bone. And we can have bones that are stiffer, and we have bones that are more pliable. Anisotropic characteristics of bone. I love saying that word because it's a mouthful. Which really means that the shape of our stress strain curve will change depending on the direction that we apply the load. So I take the same bone, let's pretend this is my femur, and I apply a compression load. So I apply a vertical load through the bone. I will have the greatest strength and the greatest stiffness. So I can resist that load best through the bone when I apply it in a longitudinal fashion, as opposed to a transverse fashion. When I look down here, I'm going to have the most pliability and the earliest fracture point. So we'll see fractures occurring much more often when I have a lateral load than when I have a compressive load. And when I start moving from that horizontal load to a load at 60 degrees, I may gain a little bit of stiffness and gain a little bit of strength. When I go to that 30 degrees closer to a vertical position, I'm going to have increased stiffness, increased strength. But when I'm looking at bone, the greatest amount of load and the greatest amount of stiffness occurs in the bone when a load is applied longitudinally through through a compression type of direction. So viscoelastic characteristics means that the bone will, the stress strain or the load and deformation or the load and displacement will vary depending on how fast I apply the load. So I apply a load quickly, and the bone will respond to that. If I have with better stiffness, better strength. If I apply the load slowly over a longer period of time, it takes less load and I get greater displacement and a longer displacement before I have a complete fracture. So viscoelasticity and viscoelastic characteristics really relate to the velocity of the load that we apply. So we can apply loads in different directions, different types. So as we mentioned a minute ago, we talked about compressive forces, and compressive forces have loads going vertically through the bone. So best example in my femur here is I'm weight bearing through the bone and I get ground reaction forces coming up, mass coming down. So typical compression force. Tensile forces are just the opposite. So I have a load moving away from the middle of the bone. So I'm stretching the bone at its long ends, and you're going to say, well, when does that ever happen? That never happens. You know, when is a bone being pulled apart? Well, every time you have a muscle attachment that is creating a force to allow the motion to occur through a joint, there is a reactive position, a reactive force that is going to be parallel to the long axis, and there will be a force that is perpendicular to the long axis. So we have tensile forces occurring on bones all the time with muscle contractions. A shear force, we have two forces that are moving in opposite directions that are perpendicular to the long axis of the bone. And these are forces that would are typically external forces that we may end up with seeing some kind of bad things happening with fractures and injuries. Torsional forces occurring with a twisting motion, with one direction of the bone being pulled in an opposite direction from the long axis. So, and then lastly, we've got compression and tensile forces occurring. Compression on one side, tensile on the other side creates a bending type of force, bending type of movement. So when I look at injury and health, we talked about how the muscular activity, we talked about how the bone will adapt to changes in forces that are applied to it. When I have a high stress and a relatively low repetition, that is sets up a situation where I may have a chance for injury. So that's the traumatic boot top fracture, where somebody's skiing down a slope and catch an edge, and their ski goes one direction, their tibia goes a different direction, and high enough force with one repetition creates an injury, creates a fracture, and we have that bending mechanism or that shearing mechanism, either one, and the bone fractures. The other type of injury we may see is with a low stress, a low load, but it happens with excessive repetition, and we can have that occurring within a certain area under the curve, which maintains health. But if we have an excessive amount of stress and or an excessive amount of repetition, we may end up outside this curve, and this is where we start to see bony breakdown with stress fractures occurring from repetitive motion, typically low level, but enough repetition, low level stress with enough repetition that creates a fracture. And it may be initially may be pain, but as that bone weakens and an athlete continues to work through that stress reaction, that stress fracture, it can turn into a high stress one repetition fracture that occurs because with what we would think of as a normal activity, that creates a fracture from the weakened bone. So the bone material is not being laid down, the bone material is being absorbed, bone becomes weak and fractures with one repetition, one activity.